Hello, so today we are going to talk about Corruption, What Everyone Needs to Know by Ray Fishman and Miriam A. Golden. This is, once again, another book from the What You Need to Know series. It's put out by Oxford University Press. I like the series a lot, which is why I keep reading them. What they do is, in a format, they ask questions and then they answer them in very simple terms. And so, in general, it seems to be a good way of getting information on a subject that is fairly well vetted, written, and curated, edited to appeal to a mainstream audience while still being technical and accurate. So, on that front, I like this a lot. I initially got it because in the United States, something I am concerned about or think a lot about is the level of corruption in the United States. And reading this book was a bit eye-opening in a way that I was not expecting, in that there really isn't as much corruption in the United States as I thought there was going in, or reading this has shifted my perspective in that way. And looking back, it kind of makes sense. And so I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent when talking about this a little bit before I start talking about the book as much, which is that people tend to have prototype effects when they are evaluating countries and thinking about countries. And what this means is they tend to think that every other country is more similar to their country than their country is similar to other countries. And so, for example, there was a study done where people from the United States were asked, how similar do you think the United States is to Mexico? And a different group, also from the United States, were asked, how similar do you think Mexico is to the United States? They voted Mexico as being more similar to the United States in terms of it scored higher, as the United States being similar to Mexico. So we tend to think that other countries are like our own countries, and when we see corruption in our country, we're like, oh, corruption's everywhere. And it's like, okay, this book really opened my eyes with that in a lot of ways, which is, first, corruption by its very nature is concealed. Generally speaking, if you are engaging in bribery and these sorts of things that are on their surface illegal, you tend to hide it. And so just because there's a lot of corruption being exposed in the press doesn't necessarily mean that there's a lot of corruption in the country, right? If you have a press that is very free and can report on it, the reporting is not indicative of rampant corruption, just a press that is capable of reporting on it. And sometimes when places where the corruption is extremely rampant, or in areas where the state controls the media and the state's engaged in the corruption, you're not going to see any reporting on it. So the reporting on it is not necessarily a good indicator. But also, the way that they talk about in this book and the particulars of the United States and corruption is that they first go out of their way to say what corruption is. And for them, corruption involves something being illegal. Like, it has to be against the law. There has to be an exchange between officials, bureaucrats, and politicians or other people in order to gain favors with these officials, and it has to be against the law. What goes on in the United States, the lobbying and that sort of stuff, is unfortunately legal. And they touch on this in the book, and they say, look, there's obviously a conflict of interest here, but this is not technical corruption because it's not against the law. And some of the things that seem problematic are the level of money in politics, as well as the revolving door type of effect, where you have politicians in the United States, they can serve as a politician, and then I think it's only a wait period of 1 year, and then they can serve as a lobbyist, and they can make like 7 figures working as a lobbyist. And the book cites some studies that seem to indicate that they are not serving as the lobbyist because they are expert, and instead it's a form of back scratching, right? But this is not against the law, you just wait your year, but it's obviously creating an environment where you can curry favor in a legal way. And so, okay. So moving on to kind of corruption, more in the sense of the book, what the book talks about, is I was shocked to hear about how common corruption is in other areas of the world and how severe it is. You have areas in the world where you can't get a doctor's appointment unless you bribe the doctor, or you can't get your kid into school unless you bribe the school teacher, and these sorts of things where people report having paid a bribe within the last year to some government official, like 80% of the time, or 80% of people report having paid a bribe within the last year, just in order to gain access to normal services. And, you have cops pulling you over, and they say, hey, do you want a ticket or do you want to bribe me? Like, these sorts of things. And it was a bit jarring for me to read, because I assume wrongly, that other countries are similar to the United States in that they are, corruption's not the norm, let's say. And that, like, bribes are not, like, a normal behavior. And in other areas of the country, you accept bribes, or not of the country. In other countries, it's a lot more the norm. And so, what the initial model that the two authors set forth to sort of explain this is that corruption, it's like a double equilibrium. Okay? If nobody engages in corruption, right, it is very risky to engage in corruption. It's risky to both offer bribes, and it's risky to both solicit bribes. And it's risky because you're going to get reported and things are going to go poorly for you. And so it is you shouldn't, if there's not a lot of corruption, you shouldn't try and bribe someone. If there is rampant corruption, then you should try and bribe someone, because you're losing access to, like, medical services and these sorts of things. And so, in terms of your own personal behavior, if you live in a low corruption society, you shouldn't engage in corruption. If you live in a high corruption society, you'd be better off if you lived in a low corruption society, but you should still, in terms of trying to get stuff going, you should still engage in the corruption. Right now, I'm looking up, there's a picture where they have, there we go. So, they have this thing where they're talking about, as the society gets more corrupt, initially, you're better off. It's talking about how good off you are, or fraction of others expected to be corrupt. Okay, the point is as you expect more other people to be corrupt, engaging in corrupt behavior becomes a better and better alternative. And this, like, also to me was important, because it really took, like, the moralizing element out of it. Because, look, if my kid's got a fever of 103, right, and I gotta bribe someone to see the doctor, I don't know if I could, sit on my high horse as much, especially knowing that everyone on my street just bribes the doctor in that situation, right? I would have to be, like, a special kind of jerk to not bribe the doctor, I think. And so it's, like, just thinking about how different cultures are different. And one of the things that the book covers a lot is, because there's like, double equilibrium, or there's, like, a threshold where it starts becoming better to expect others to be corrupt. And once you pass that threshold, then everyone bandwagons, and it's like you fall into a corrupt society. And then if you're on the other side of the threshold, and it's better to not act corrupt, people bandwagon, they don't act corrupt, and it self-reinforces. In both instances, it self-reinforces. And so these are stable equilibriums, because they will trend just completely towards non-corruption or corruption. Because of this, corruption is actually very difficult to combat and change and deal with once it's already there. And the book spends a lot of time talking about how it's difficult, and no matter what, like, sorts of interventions you're going at, they are not going to, they're like, there's two-sided effects. Like, so for example, there are arguments that increasing public officials' salaries is a good way to decrease corruption, and to some extent this is true, and here's why it's true. In some areas of the world, there's actually an expectation that as a public official you take bribes, so they pay them a very low amount, because they're under the expectation that they're taking bribes anyways, and they need to, like, pad their salaries with bribes. And so when you pay them more, you eliminate this sort of, like, need basis for bribes. But then, and this effect is, this is noticeable, where you increase public officials' salaries, like police officers and, like, this sort of type of stuff, they solicit less bribes. But there's other studies that, like, kind of give contradictory sort of evidence, in that if it is really, if you can get paid a lot of money, being a public servant, then that will attract the type of people who are in it for the money. And then they talk about how in some areas, like or some people advocate for no pay for public officials, and it should instead be like a service type of thing. And in this case of like police officers, like you shouldn't pay them too much, or you should not make the pay such that it is attractive to people who are acting out of selfishness as opposed to desire to help the public good, because this is going to, attract the type of people you don't want in public service. And so it's difficult to fight. This is like one of the things the book talks about a lot. Another thing that I was very surprised to hear in the book, or read it, as it were, is that if you look at things that correlate with corruption, democracy does not correlate very strongly with corruption, in that there's not a strong relationship. There are authoritarian, non-democratic countries that are not very corrupt at all, and this is, I think Singapore was one of the examples. I really don't know that too much about Singapore, but I think it's Singapore. They really crack down on corruption, and it turns out, or like this is what it appears to be the case, if you have an authoritarian government in place, and that authoritarian government decides it wants to fight corruption, man oh man, and I mean really fight it, like really make it a priority, man, they're really effective at doing it, because you don't have checks and balances, and so it's much easier to marshal the energy. The flip side is, if you want to be corrupt and you're in an authoritarian place in power, you just have unlimited power to do it, right? And so, in a democracy, you have like checks and balances, and people are elected, and you would think that the way the democracy would sort out the corruption is when you have corrupt politicians, you just don't re-elect them. But it turns out that in a lot of places where corruption is predominant, people are put in a position where they sell their vote, and a lot of people, they like it's like you like lose the means to like really survive or really make it in a lot of like areas of the country, or not of the country, in the world, that are like incredibly corrupt, and like people sell their vote, and like it just perpetuates this sort of thing. Also, just like there's a lot of when people think corruption is rampant, it actually makes people less likely to participate in the democratic process. All this stuff was very interesting to read. So it turns out not a strong correlation between a country, whether or not a country is a democracy, and how corrupt the country is. The relationship isn't very strong. Most of the least corrupt countries tend to be democracies, but that's what it correlates more strongly with is not the system of government as much as the wealth of the GDP per capita. The best predictor of if a country is going to be corrupt or not is how wealthy it is. And so there's a lot of stuff going on here, like I talked about earlier with the officials. Like if you have a country that can afford to pay its officials more, right, they will not be in a position where they, in order to make ends meet, they have to skim money off the top, this type of thing. There are a lot of mechanisms in which just being in a wealthier country tends to reduce corruption. There's also a larger middle class. The middle class tends to be the pusher of anti-corruption efforts. If you live in an area where there's like no middle class, and where people like are trying to scrape enough to get by, enough to eat, they'll like sell their votes for money, and like or like regions that support them will like get the government projects, so it becomes such that like you really need to like support candidates that like are maybe corrupt. It's rough. And so all this was this factor that the democracy is not really a driving characteristic of reducing corruption so much as wealth was interesting. Another thing is transparency and accountability. So having a free press seems to be, the book did not emphasize this much, but they did talk about it a little bit, and it's something to me seems quite important is having a free press, because one of the things the book talks about is having this public expectation. So the more you think everyone else is engaged in corruption, the more it is the case that you should try and, as a player of the game in terms of economics, the more you should engage in it yourself. So having a public perception of a high corruption environment or a low corruption environment is really important. And when you have transparency and accountability and a lot of public perception type stuff, it seems to be the case that it is easier to inform the public or get the public on the same page when you're having a shifting in the winds in terms of trying to reduce the corruption. They talk a little bit at the very end about social media and its impact. I think this book was written in 2015, 2016, so it's it's obviously a bit behind the developments of today, but it seems to be the case that social media is a pretty big impact on keeping people accountable, and so we'll see how that develops in the future. But anyways, let's get into the ratings a little bit, because or actually, just to summarize, I really went into reading this thinking that I wanted to be oh, in America there's so much corruption, it's terrible. And then I read it and it's oh well, on any metric by which you can measure corruption, America scores quite well. And and then I read about how corruption works in other countries, and a reporter interviewing someone who talks about how they were solicited to, they were offered a bribe to vote for someone, and instead of the narrative being oh, of course I didn't accept the bribe to vote for someone, the person was I didn't accept the bribe, I'm holding out for a bigger number, I want a candidate that'll pay me more. It's just oh Jesus, this is and it's just it's the model of equilibriums where it's either not very corrupt at all or extremely corrupt is incredibly interesting, and it also explains why you just get hyper corruption versus not. And so if you live in a society that's not particularly corrupt, it's a bit outside what your reality looks like in terms of thinking about this hyper corrupt thing. And you just think of your own country, and when you see corruption in your own country, you're oh, this is terrible. But it's it's not that terrible, unless your country is Nigeria, and then it is that terrible. They have corruption problems. And another thing was if you have low GDP per capita, I think was it, and you have a lot of natural resources. Having a lot of natural resources can be a really bad thing in terms of corruption. And I think Nigeria has a lot of oil. Can't remember the details on this, but anyways, let's get into the ratings. So for utility, I gave it a 2.5. I don't think this book is useful, except if you're discussing corruption with someone. I think this book's a pretty efficient read in terms of understanding corruption better. It's just it's hard to think of a situation where knowing this type of stuff is useful. I suppose if you're traveling and you're going to a place where there's a lot of corruption, just be more ready to pay bribes or something, or just aware of that you might be being shaken down for a bribe at some point in time, and perhaps that's useful. I don't do too much traveling, so that's a bit outside my wheelhouse, but it's something that's interesting to think about. But overall, as far as books go, I don't think this is. It's just not that useful. For novelty, I give it a 6.5. I was not expecting to hear some of the stuff about corruption, and then some of the stuff it's okay, this makes sense. But the model at the start, where it's talking about the double equilibrium, that was tremendously interesting. Democracy is not really being a very strong factor in correlating with corruption was also pretty interesting to me. I would have expected that it would have correlated quite strongly with being a democracy, because you vote the corrupt people out of power, but it seems that that's not really how that works, and people who are corrupt can also hijack the democratic process. Okay. I was also a bit surprised to read very consistently that the United States, in terms of corruption, is not particularly bad, although the caveat, the asterisk, is that the way that they're measuring corruption throughout the book involves engaging in illegal behavior, and a lot of the stuff that's problematic in the United States is legal. So And the book kind of just says, there's some subjectivity to this because, what criteria are you going to use to evaluate corruption if you are evaluating stuff that's not illegal, and then it becomes like a very subjective type of thing, and they're like saying, look, it's much easier to empirically examine stuff that's illegal as being a line crossing behavior as opposed to stuff that's legal because it's much more clearly demarcated. So okay, for entertainment I give it a 3.5. It's like not that entertaining. It wasn't like pulling teeth or anything getting through it. Like the book wasn't terrible. There was one like tidbit that was somewhat entertaining, reading about this public official who he was a university professor. I forget which country this was, or state, or like he eventually became a mayor. I think it was a South American country that had like a really high murder rate in a particular city. And this guy, he was a school teacher before, and he got fired from his job because at an assembly, when everyone was being really loud, he mooned all of them. So he pulled down his pants and showed them his ass. And everyone shut up. And he was just like, sometimes you need a bit of a different approach. And he was like, it was effective. And so later he gets elected mayor to try and clean up a city. And, of course, he goes for a bit of a different approach. And one of the ways of trying to combat corruption in the city is like you have a lot of like traffic crimes, right? And this city had like it was known for having the worst murder rate as a result of gang activity. Like this is a bad city in terms of like I guess crime and corruption. And so one thing is you wanted to solve his traffic crimes, and so one of the approaches he did is he hired theater actors to dress up as mimes and to mock people who were jaywalking, and to like wave cards at them with like a thumbs down thing. And like it's just a very interesting type of approach, and the approach was remarkably effective, and it seems like effective on because it it deals with a few of the things, and namely, and I think the funniest point is, you can't exactly bribe the mime to not mock you. That seems just like crazy, right? And so like if it were police officers giving like jaywalking tickets, what happens is when you send out more beat cops to like give tickets is they just like solicit bribes, right? Which is like a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. How do you solve this like crime thing and reduce corruption when like the means by which you could do it would increase corruption? The mimes aren't giving you a ticket, so like bribing them is like incoherent. But also like the social pressure of being shamed is particularly I guess annoying. And the mimes would also hand out cards to allow the people to mock each other. And so and then like a second point is like they're doing jaywalking, which is very visible when someone does it, and so it's like very visible when they're mocking them. But it's also not like a very serious crime. Like obviously, if you had mimes trying to enforce like serious crimes, they'd probably be killed in an area that has like this crazy high murder rate. I forget what city it was, but anyways, it was a good way of changing the public opinion. And remember, the public. It's about an equilibrium, so the public opinion is really important. And so like if the public opinion is that corruption is being dealt with, and you can reach over the equilibrium point where people start thinking corruption is unacceptable, then you start getting progress, and you will trend towards the anti-corruption type of society. And so and like murder rates went way down in the city, and happily ever after. Anyways, that part was entertaining, but that's just like one little snippet. For the most part, corruption's actually kind of a bit of a dry topic, and it's scandalous when you know it's happening and like that type of stuff. It's not dry at all when it's like you're a politician, but just like hearing about it in the abstract, it's like a little bit dry. And so, okay, 3.5, maybe a little harsh, maybe not. It isn't like the book's not tremendously bad to read, so. It's getting some points. Style 6.5, fairly well written, like clear, like these books always are. There's nothing like crazy nice. Like the style is not like hyper pleasing or something like this, but the style is highly readable, which is readable 7. Given that they're covering like a somewhat technical topic and it's technical people doing it, and they're experts in their stuff, and it's like the it's substantive contact. It's not like someone kind of who's a good writer just blowing wind type of thing. I think they do fairly well with the writing, and it's readable and okay. And for interesting, I give it a 6.5. There's a few points that I was really interested in, but a lot of it was just non-interesting. So the parts that were interesting is just the interest level of the book's hyper-polarized. So like maybe there's 10 pages of the book that are tremendously interesting, and then the rest of it's just kind of like, okay. And so overall it gives a 6.5 because I do find the points I've emphasized already, probably more than enough, very interesting. And so, which gives an overall score of not that high. I think it's a 5.42. I have to scroll to the side. Oh my god. My computer's not... Yeah, 5.42. Which is not that high. I think that it should perhaps be higher than this. I think the quality of the book overall is higher. I just think that topically, it's maybe not that useful a topic, and it's maybe not tremendous. I don't know. I think the book's fairly well done. If I were just to try and rate the book without using my rating systems, I would rate it much higher than a 5.42, maybe low 6s, something like this. If corruption's an interesting topic to you, as far as recommendations go, if corruption's an interesting topic to you, I would recommend this book. If it's not an interesting topic to you, I would not recommend this book at all. And I would just, a lot of the stuff that's tremendously interesting about this book, you can read in a 1-page essay, is kind of the thing, I guess. And so, or you just watch this video and I just explained it. And these things are tremendously interesting. The democracy is not being really effective at reducing corruption, or the correlation's extremely weak or non-existent. That was a big one. But yeah, as far as recommendations go, I would not widely recommend this particular book. However, if you are interested in a topic of some kind and you look up, I would suggest looking up the What Everyone Needs to Know series and see if there's something on that topic for you, because I think the series is quite strong. And so as a series, I would recommend this series because I just keep getting books from them. They explain stuff in a way that's very simplistic. I consider the information quite reliable because it's a matter of trusting the editorial oversight of Oxford University, and then once you're doing that, you can it frees you up to look at these introductory books and have a high level of trust. And so it makes it easier to introduce yourself to a topic. Because one of the problems with getting an introductory level book that's supposed to kind of introduce you to a topic is because by the very structure of you not being an expert, you're really not in a place to evaluate if they are doing a good job, right? Or if the information's particularly good. It's this very vulnerable position in terms of information evaluation. And so I think that having this third party with editorial oversight that you trust is actually a really good look. And also the books have all been really readable, which I think is a important thing, because a lot of times experts write stuff and they are just incoherent because they forget what it's like to not know what they know, and they use a bunch of terminology that's it's all very technical within their field. And so would highly recommend this sort of thing. As far as discussion goes, has anyone ever been solicited to give a bribe by a public official in whatever country they're from? So what country are you from, and has anyone ever tried to get you to bribe them or solicited a bribe? I think that would be a bit interesting, although obviously this is not any sort of empirically well, it's if there's a bunch of people from one country in the comment section, it's not going to be indicative of anything because the sample's not random. But it would be overwhelmingly English-speaking languages, right? Because I'm speaking English. Anyways, have a good one. Like, comment, subscribe, that stuff. YouTube, algo, yada yada. Have a good one.